This is only my second sermon of 2023. My first one I got to preach for Erica's ordination to the priesthood, and that got the cobwebs out, I think. So anyway, it is so good to be with you and so delightful to be with you, particularly with these texts to work with. I'm so glad that the church fathers saw to it to appoint Ezekiel as one of the readings for today, because this is actually one of the options among the many on the Easter Vigil service. In the Easter Vigil service, we recount salvation's history, and there are 6 readings that we could do during that service. We've never included that many in ours, and this is one of them. It's hard in planning the service for Easter Vigil to figure out what to leave out because there are so many good ones. They're all so good. So I thought, okay, good, we'll do Ezekiel today, and then everybody will get it. This is a very evocative text because it speaks of a valley of dry bones, and we know what dry bones look like. It is told during the time of the Hebrew people being in exile from their homeland, and they felt out of sorts. They felt disjointed and fragmented without the rituals that they had day in and day out and the place that they had to carry out those rituals. So this prophecy of Ezekiel's is meant to impart to them the promise of God's salvation, no matter the circumstances. In this story, we see that God makes the Hebrew people his people. It's God that makes them his people, regardless of their location. They can't do it themselves, but it is their responsibility to let it be done to them. Now, we got to recognize that it's easy to let things happen to us when we're dead, right? No pushback for many of us when we're dead. We see in this text that God rejoins them, ligaments, and then flesh, meaning the muscle, and then skin. I was thinking how much animation could add to this text. Can you envision it? A picture on the screen of little white lines laying there horizontally, and then all of a sudden there are things that pull them together, and then you see the muscles start to lay over the bones, and then you see the skin come around and pull it all tight, and you would be as surprised as anyone to say, oh my gosh, those were people? I had no idea. It just looked like little horizontal white lines. The imagery of this reminds us that it is in our nature of being the people of God that we come together. It is in our religion that we come together and are joined one to another. Whenever that happens, whether it's every Sunday or every other Sunday or once a month or where 2 or 3 are gathered, God unites us into one body. We show up as little horizontal lines, but in God we become one, bound to each other again as God's body in the world. It is God that makes us. It's God that made us, and it's God that makes us still. How is it that we can remember that we are God's, made by God, being made by God? Perhaps we can liken it to someone who is preparing to cook. The cook gets together all of the ingredients, including the dishes and the heat, and sets aside the time so that a good meal can come from it. The cook situates themselves so that the good food can come. And that's how we remember that we are God's. We situate ourselves so that we can be in a place where God can remember us, and we can remember ourselves. Worship is one way that's designed to do just that. I want to thank you for my sabbatical time. There were many opportunities for worship with different communities and different settings. It was a dense and rich 12 weeks away. It was all that I envisioned and hoped for, and yet beyond what I envisioned and hoped for. And I promise not to try to summarize it here in this sermon, but I do want to tell you the story of the last 10 days. As we came around the bend in time to March, I started to notice the time going away. I had already lived deeply into January and February, and now I was getting to the countdown. And although I was eager to be among you again, I was also wanting to savor these last few days and kind of in a feeling of, oh no, am I going to notice? Am I going to savor it? So I looked back at some of the things I had set out to do during my time, and there were a couple things that still remained. One is to go on a silent retreat. This is something I love to do because in silence, time expands and becomes big and spacious enough to hold the full weight of life. So I reached out to my usual place, the Society of St. John the Evangelist in Cambridge, and they were full. Actually, I didn't bother reaching, it said it on their website. I reached out to the people at Holy Cross Monastery in New York, they were full. I thought, where else have I gone on retreat here in Connecticut? I reached out to one of those places. They could take me for 2 days, but not the 4. So then I started to Google retreat places in Massachusetts, retreat places in Maine, retreat places in New Hampshire. I had already reached out to one retreat place in Albuquerque, New Mexico, because it's where the Center for Action and Contemplation is homed, and I wanted to go and visit that spot in my time of my journey, but it just hadn't come together. And the woman had replied back when I had looked out to the end of March for these dates and told me that they were full. But any other time, she said, just let me know. So I sent back an email and said, forgive me if this seems rude, because I'm only moving the dates over by like 2 days. But any chance that if I move the dates over by 2 days, there might be space? Now, this was 2 weeks ago tomorrow. This was the Monday, 2 weeks from my coming back. And she said, actually, someone just canceled. And I said, oh my goodness. So on Tuesday, I made plans, and on Thursday, I was in Albuquerque. And I got the Hermitage at this Norbertine Spirituality Center. They're a branch of the Roman Catholic Church, or a dimension of them. And I got this really nice place, but the rate for the cheap room that I asked for, but the cancellation was with the nice room. It actually was like a little apartment. It's called a hermitage, but it was well beyond any hermitage type of setting. A living room and bedroom and a full-stocked kitchen of dishes and all the stuff. So I got to sink into 4 days of silence there. Getting up in the morning, since my body hadn't changed time, to sit in the recliner, facing out over the picture window, to watch the sun come up over the Sandia Mountain and the Rio Grande Valley. I kept all the lights off in the living room, covered myself with a wool blanket and my coffee, and pushed play on morning prayer on the morning prayer app. 4 days of silence. Of course, I talked to people when I engaged them, but I binged on audio recordings of Teresa of Avila and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, wanting to be companioned by mystics from long, long ago. I spent hours at the Center for Action and Contemplation, which is simply a courtyard, walked their labyrinth, hiked in the mountains, worshipped with some folks in Santa Fe. Came home, and a few days later submitted my doctoral project, which had been with the editor for that weekend. She said, I can't get it back to you till after the weekend. I said, that's fine. And then anticipated returning with all our kids home the weekend right before I came back. These days when I was anticipating the end is coming, were filled beyond what I could anticipate and infused my prayer life, my journey in ways that I couldn't have anticipated. I highlight the word anticipate because I think so much of our lives is born in that time. We spend a lot of our time anticipating, whether it be joy or dread. What if? Here it comes. But to drop into silence, to drop into prayer, it's like swimming in the deep water where you're weightless and there's no sound. I was being held, actually I would say embraced, in a way that gave me freedom of movement and freedom from the ways around me. And I remembered in that space that I belonged to God. There was nothing to distract me from this truth. It is true that our circumstances, the parts of our day, the work that we work on, the things that are outside of our control, no matter our age, we can allow these to define us. They can shape our understanding of ourselves, and they can shape our understanding of God. This is true in our texts this morning. In this story of Lazarus, Martha came to Jesus and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Because you see, these are the circumstances. My brother is dead." Jesus delivers that word to the disciples. Lazarus is dead. We know the power of those words when they've been told to us, the finality of them. She does know that it's God who makes us, and God who made us, and God who makes us still. And Jesus reveals that to her. In that present moment, which is all that we have, all the past is in the present, and the future is in the present too. In that moment, something new breaks open. Martha thinks that this is the end of the story for her brother Lazarus, because the tomb has always been the end of the story. Always. And yet she also knows from what she witnessed Jesus do that he could have saved her brother, that he saves. She's seen it with her own eyes. This is also true in Ezekiel, the prophet. He speaks from his own history. I love his answer when the Lord says to him, "Tell me about these bones." He's like, "Oh, Lord, you know. I'm not even going to answer. I already know that you've broken my imagination before, and I'm not even going to answer because I know that I don't know. So I'm not going to give an answer." I love that. You can see the comedy in it. It's already wrong. Whatever I'm going to say is wrong. So, oh, Lord, you know. How is it that God is making us? How is it that God is making us? We spent a lot of time last year beginning to remember ourselves as the body of Christ, and this metaphor changes our understanding of ourselves, the church. It moves us from thinking of ourselves as an institution and applying institutional efforts to our life to thinking of ourselves as relationships created and fostered by Jesus' love in us, Christ's presence in us. We use the same word for both meanings. We've gotten the hang of this real well. How is God inviting us to get the hang of this? We belong to God rather than our circumstances. And as we feel the feelings of our circumstances, we might believe that we're created by them. Yet it is God who creates us, and it is God to whom we belong, not only individually, but corporately. We don't belong to our circumstances. I love that about the hymn we sang right before the gospel, "Precious Lord, take my hand. Lead me from these circumstances," because I'm crushed by them. And I want to remember who I belong to. Lazarus didn't belong to his circumstances. The Hebrew people didn't belong to their circumstances. And they, as us, needed to be reminded again and again and again, because it's so easy to forget. And remember the extremity of their circumstances. Think about dry bones. You've seen them. You've been on hikes, right? Been out in the woods or in the fields, and you come across a bone. You know a dry bone. It's gray. It's like jagged on the edges. It weighs hardly anything. You know you can't even boil that thing to get something out of it, right? That's the image we are invited to consider. There is literally no life in these things. I can't even get bone broth from it. Same for Lazarus being in the tomb. It's been 4 days. Like the body has started to decompose. That's why it smells. These extreme stories are meant to come into our hearts, and so that we can remember our own story, so that we can remember that we belong to God. And when we think of our circumstances and we think, "Oh no, this is really bad, this is like really, really bad," we are meant in our mind, in our heart, to run to the end where it's dead and say, "God can do something in this space even now." Do you want to wait until it's dead? God is not formed by our circumstances. It's the circumstances that submit to his authority. And we realize that even as we remember John 9, the gospel passage that was read last week. We've been reading whole chapters of the Bible in case you didn't notice, because how can you cut the story off? But in the story last week of the blind man, people say, "Who sinned, Jesus, that this man was born blind?" And Jesus says, "Nobody, neither his parents nor him. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." How does God listen and respond to our circumstances so that we can remember that we belong to God? We, as the people of St. Stephen's, may say woe about the budget, or woe about the pledge numbers, or woe about the number of or lack of number of volunteers. Yet these circumstances do not define us. As long as we believe they do, we'll be distracted by them. We'll be distracted by them, and we'll be distracted from the truth that we belong to God. And here is the amazing thing. Inversely, when we remember that we belong to God, both individually and collectively, it can be true in your own life or in our corporate life, the circumstances change. I want to repeat that truth. When we remember that we belong to God, the circumstances change. In these upcoming months and years, I want to assist you and us in remembering that you belong to God, we belong to God. And there are many ways in which we can remember this together. We, St. Stephen's, will be celebrating 300 years in 2025. The Christian community that God is building in us now will be that which carries us into that year of celebration. There are so many ways in which we can build Christian community that reflect our belonging to God. I want to share with you a few ideas born from the list of community aspects that I shared in last year's annual address, taken from the work of Mark Lau Branson and Juan Martinez. There are 6 qualities of a community. There's memories of shared experiences and narratives inherited from predecessors. What if we create an oral history project, maybe like StoryCorps, or do videos on social media of stories which tell about what happens here? A second feature of community is that it's cooperative side-by-side activities rooted in shared meaning and goals, like our outreach activities, how it is that we face the community together. A third quality is shared hope and imagination concerning future life together. So opportunities to talk about what we want St. Stephen's to look and feel like, trying new ideas together. We plan to hire a full-time associate for youth and family this calendar year. And the Decker Fund and those that are working with that supports the ministry for folks that are over 60. A fourth quality is relative intimacy, proximity, and permanence. A fifth is unspecialized face-to-face association, ways of crossing paths, just casually. We're going to do some of this in our potluck after worship today, but other ways we could do it, community dinners, maybe attend a minor league baseball game, just ways that we get to be in relationship with each other. And the sixth feature is to adapt, resist, embrace, and challenge the influences of societies and cultures. How is it that we, St. Stephen's, can offer the liberating and caring message necessary, needed, hungry in this hurting world? And whether it's on the topic of systemic oppression or focus on climate change or inviting people to live a prayerful life, what kind of efforts might we undertake together? These are just ideas off the top of my head, and maybe you've had ones you've been carrying around in you. I can look out there and identify a few of you that have told me good ones. In the weeks after Easter and before Memorial Day, I hope to create a 10 to 12 building community steering committee, people of various ages who can make some plans, and then we can choose some out of all of them for the coming year that can give us opportunities to build the community that helps us remember that we belong to God. Now, it is certain that the circumstances of our life are real. Let's not fool ourselves. We can't transcend them. Just pretend like none of this touches us. It does touch us. And God knows all of these circumstances are real. And yet we don't belong to these circumstances. So how can we situate ourselves together to remember that we belong to God? And how is God using these circumstances, like the dry bones, like Lazarus in the tomb? He waited, you see. And like the blind man, how is God using our circumstances to make the point that we belong to God real to us? The truth that we belong to God always have and always will belong to God, and that we don't belong to anything else but God, it's hard to remember. We often forget. Such is our sin. The mystics, Julian of Norwich, the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, they have gone before to remind us of this. In closing, I'll just tell you a little story about Teresa, as I binged on a podcast about her. I learned about her life. It was kind of hard, and kind of is a gentle way to tell you it was really, really, really hard. She lived during the Spanish Inquisition in Spain. Anybody who studied the Spanish Inquisition knows that that was not a nice time, right? They were killing everybody for anything. The church had the authority of the kingdom, and if you were a Moor, or if you were a Muslim, or if you were a Jew, they were after you. And everyone had to make account for why they were really Christian. Teresa was no exception. In fact, she had some Jewish heritage in her blood. That one-drop rule applied back then. And she was brought before the church 3 times to defend her Christian faith. And according to the people in the podcast, she was like, I'm over this. Kill me if you want to. I know this is true. And she just told them what it was, and they're like, that is true. And they would let her go. But they got nervous again and again. So not only was she dealing with people breathing down her neck and wanting to catch her being a bad person, she was also trying to reform the church. She was establishing convents and monasteries. And as I reflect on her life, I'm like, oh my gosh, they didn't even have powered motors then. Like they would write things out and mail them, and not even mail them, they would be delivered by somebody. One of the podcast leaders said, yeah, I love her so much because she's so human. She's like, I don't know where I left off in my last writing, and I'm too tired to figure it out, so I'm just going to start here. And she just started writing with a quill. So when I think about my life, me with my word processing systems and my computer that automatically saves, my capacity to forward things without doing anything but push a button, when I think about the fact that I have electricity and it just comes on, and that I can use a motor and some gas to get me someplace, I think, oh my, I'm sorry, Teresa. I'm sorry you had it so rough. I would like to use all of these for excuses as to why I don't pray. In fact, they're right handy. But if I look at your life, I have to confess that they don't even compare. It would be embarrassing to compare my difficulties to you. I don't want to do it. Let's not. I just want to decide to rely on God now. I don't want to wait till my life gets as hard as yours. I don't want to wait until I'm unable to see or dead or I'm just dry bones. I want to do it now. And so that's what I invite you into with the friends of the faithful that have gone before. I want you to know, just as I want to know myself, that I belong to God, not to my circumstances. Because I know that if I know this, others will know it too. My family will start to know it. You all will start to know it. My friends will start to know it. And as everyone admits their hardship, names it specifically, we'll be able to see that God is in the midst of it. We can be very present to the truth of it and still have the capacity to say, don't despair. God uses our circumstances. Yes, God uses even our circumstances to reveal to us that we are not victims of them. We belong to God. Amen.